Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm really happy to have you here today. If you're new, thank you for joining. This is a place where we explore deep ideas, but always in an accessible and thoughtful way. So feel free to grab a drink, sit back, and let's take our time with this one. In today's episode, we'll dive into a concept that affects politics, history, and even our daily life, often without us realizing: the psychology of crowds. We'll look at how human behavior changes when we are part of a group, how emotion spreads like fire in a crowd, and why great leaders, or dangerous ones, are often masters at influencing collective minds. We'll center our discussion around the work of Gustave Le Bon, a French social psychologist who wrote one of the earliest and most influential books on the topic. But we'll also connect his ideas to modern events, including a striking example from recent American history. So whether you're someone who loves psychology, sociology, or just wants to understand people better, this episode is for you. Let's get started. Today I want to explore with you a profound investigation into human behavior, focusing on the psychology of crowds. Gustave Le Bon's classic book, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, first published in 1895, remains a cornerstone of social psychology. Le Bon observed that when individuals merge into a crowd, they form a distinct collective consciousness, an entity quite different from the sum of its parts. He described stages like submergence, contagion, and suggestion. In the submergence stage, individuals gradually lose their distinctiveness, surrendering their personal responsibility to the group's anonymity. In contagion, emotions and behaviors spread rapidly across the crowd, much like an infectious disease. Suggestion refers to the crowd's heightened susceptibility to ideas and slogans, especially simple, vivid ones. Le Bon argued that the crowd's intellectual capacities diminish. They become impulsive, irritable, incapable of critical judgment, exaggerative in their sentiments, and highly suggestible. The individual acts not as a rational being, but as part of a hypnotic, emotional organism. He believed that the crowd's minds were dominated by unconscious drives rather than reason, and moral responsibility faded in the anonymity of large numbers. Modern research has refined and challenged aspects of Le Bon's theory. Empirical studies of de-individuation show that anonymity and immersion in group contexts reduce individual restraint, often leading to impulsive or anti-normative behavior. Yet more recent frameworks like the social identity model of de-individuation effects, SIDE, suggest that behavior in crowds depends significantly on group identity and norms, not merely psychic dissolution. Le Bon's contagion theory evolved into what social psychologists call behavioral or emotional contagion. Initial ideas of suggestion as automatic transmission have been transformed. Now we see that people imitate behaviors not unconsciously, but often via recognizable social cues, copying others to reduce uncertainty or belong. Despite criticisms, Le Bon's observations still resonate centuries later. The idea that crowds simplify ideas, emotionally amplify messages, and are guided by symbolic leadership remains powerful. He asserted that crowds prefer slogans, stark imagery, repeated messages, things that bypass reason and appeal directly to emotion. Speakers and leaders who master such simplicity can steer the crowd's mood. These points echo in modern political rallies, advertising, and online movements. A powerful real-world example of this dynamic was the January 6, 2021 attack on the United States Capitol. What began as a political rally quickly transformed into a violent crowd event. People who might never have broken the law on their own found themselves storming a government building. Le Bon would likely argue that they were swept away by crowd suggestibility, a shared emotional environment, constant repetition of powerful slogans, and the visual presence of flags, chants, and group identity symbols made critical thinking nearly impossible. The psychological shift from individual to crowd mind was evident. People acted impulsively, irrationally, and often violently, not necessarily because they were inherently violent, but because being in the crowd altered their state of mind. The sense of anonymity, shared emotion, and purpose created the perfect conditions for mass suggestion to take over. What has changed is our understanding of context. Le Bon minimalistically treated crowds as irrational masses, ignoring political, social, and cultural forces shaping group behavior. Critics including Clark MacPhail, Stephen Riker, and others highlight how modern crowd phenomena reflect shared identity, ideological frames, social norms, and collective purpose, not just emotional contagion or hypnosis. For example, Riker studied political events and protest movements and emphasizes that crowd participants act out of collective identity, not mindless dissolution. He argues that violence at rallies is better explained by perceived threats to group fate, us versus them constructions, emotional reinforcement between leaders and followers, not innate barbarism. Contemporary sociology and phenomenology even challenge the very idea of a singular crowd mind. Papers argue that Le Bon's disease model of emotion transfer is scientifically weak, that emotion spread involves conscious recognition and mutual awareness. Crowds are diverse, often containing multiple intentions and social layers, not the homogeneous angry mass Le Bon imagined. Yet Le Bon's ambition was striking. He sought laws of crowd behavior and aimed to influence statesmanship in the Third Republic of France. He saw crowds as political forces and advised leaders to understand them, to seduce rather than legislate, since laws and institutions exert little influence over mass sentiments. After his era, crowd psychology influenced classical sociologists and psychologists. Normative studies such as Zimbardo's de-individuation, the behaviorist tradition, early phenomenologists all drew implicitly on Le Bon's imagery to explain anti-normative, emotional group behavior. In recent decades, technological and network theory transformed the field. Social contagion research now spans digital platforms, viral trends, emotional cascades online. Scholars like Nicholas Christakis and Damon Centola show that behaviors or opinions, prosocial actions, risk perceptions, voting behavior, can cascade through social networks with measurable impact. These are forms of contagion compatible with Le Bon's ideas, but now grounded in data and network modeling. Computer models like the social force and evacuation simulations infuse psychological realism into physical dynamics. They integrate stress responses, grouping behavior, helping tendencies, social identity, even walking patterns in dense crowds. These show that individuals act as agents guided by both psychological states and spatial interactions, not passive components of a hypnotic mass. As for the dual nature of crowds, modern views, they are not inherently dangerous mobs, nor purely rational assemblies. They can be both creative and destructive. Dan Hancock and others argue that labeling all protests as chaotic mob rule is elitist and often inaccurate. Peaceful mass gatherings cultivate kinship, confidence, solidarity, even joy, rather than mindless violence. Yet Le Bon's warning remains relevant. Crowds can be powerful instruments of manipulation. Charismatic figures use simple symbols and emotional appeals to mobilize masses. Politically, advertisers, populist leaders, social media influencers exploit crowd susceptibility to suggestion and contagion. So what are the practical lessons? First, know that being part of a crowd changes how we think. We become more emotional, less critical, more suggestible. We associate our identity with the groups. Second, ideas matter. Slogans, repetition, symbolic imagery can carry enormous weight. Third, context matters. Crowd behavior derives from ideology, ritual, culture, not just from raw emotion. Fourth, individuals still have agency. They choose to participate, dissent, even help others within crowds. As citizens or communicators, we should ask, am I thinking independently or merely echoing a repeating chorus? Am I aware of what norms bind this crowd? Am I being led by symbols or by reason? These reflections are essential in a world where physical crowds mingle with virtual ones, where likes, shares, and hashtags create digital mobs with real psychological power. In conclusion, Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd remains a provocative foundation. His ideas of submergence, contagion, suggestion, anonymity continue to offer insight into crowd behavior. But the field has evolved, adding nuance through identity, social norms, network contagion, and context. Crowds can unite or destroy. They can build solidarity or incite division. Studying them teaches us about the power and peril of collective psychology, and ultimately, about what it means to be human in community. By understanding these dynamics, we become not only better communicators and analysts, but more self-aware individuals in the mix of collective life. Thank you for listening.